Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. You know, there were a lot of public denials by Joseph Smith, but was he part of a conspiracy to keep polygamy a secret? You'd think some of the polygamy skeptics would acknowledge that, but they really like to go after his public denials. Dr. Jesse James is a research psychologist, and we're going to be talking about some of the contemporary evidence and some of the conspiracy theories around this. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out.
I'm going to talk about some of these. First, source authenticity and provenance. This is one that the skeptics are actually pretty good at. They're trying to go back and evaluating the potential bias, the potential coercion that might have gone into like the signing of the affidavits. They'll look at the affidavits individually and they'll see like, wow, this signature doesn't match other signed documents by the same person. Or they'll see like, this was included as one of Joseph Smith's wives, but like this affidavit was never signed and she never admitted that she was a wife. And so like maybe somebody assumed she was a wife at some point and drafted the affidavit, but if she never signed it, maybe that's a level of evidence that maybe we shouldn't count among, we shouldn't consider valid. We shouldn't count that among Joseph Smith's wives, for example. So that's the kind of thing where the skeptics are actually doing a pretty good job of questioning that. Another one is temporal proximity. So the longer an event happens, the longer a telling happens after the actual event occurs, the more suspect that is, the more proximal it is in time to the actual event. Like if you write a journal entry the day of it occurring in the evening, then historians would generally give a lot more credence to that than to some later recollection, right? And so skeptics are also pretty good at this one. They'll try to discount later recollections, but problematically, they don't appropriately give allowances for misremembering that happens, that there's a natural degradation of memory. So if people are remembering something 30 years down the road, they might remember the general gist of what happened, but they might misremember the people who were involved. They might misremember the date that it happened. And if they're signing an affidavit to the best of their recollection of when it happened and who might have been there, that doesn't mean that we should hold them to every detail that they've outlined there, because there's going to be some natural degradation in memory. You can't say that whole thing is a lie or it's bunk or it's coerced just because there are some inaccuracies in that. You have to give allowances for that natural loss of memory, and I've seen that a lot of times the skeptics are holding witnesses, later recollecting witnesses, to unreasonable standards.
Exactly.
Yeah, very exacting standards of about dates and who was present, and if there's any inaccuracy at all,
throw it all out.
Yep, throw it out.
But they want to throw it out because they have motivated reasoning to do so.
Exactly. Yeah. And as we saw, other later recollections that agree with what they're
don't look at those nearly as hard.
Yeah, exactly. Then they'll say, okay, we'll buy this one, even though it might be susceptible to the same kind of memory biases that all the other ones were. Right? Okay, so another academic standard of conducting history is the issue of corroboration. You have to find multiple sources saying the same kind of thing in order for you to be more likely to trust it. If one source says something just off on the side, they're the only person who ever claimed that, then you have to view it with a little bit of suspicion. But if multiple sources all come together and suggest the same kind of thing,
especially when they come from different groups,
exactly,
pro and con.
Yeah, if there's hostile sources, then that bolsters the argument a lot more, right? So people. We know that there's lots of people who implicated Joseph in polygamy, who were, of course, in the Brighamite tradition, but also in the RLDS tradition, where it was motivated not to implicate Joseph in polygamy because of
William Marks.
Yeah, exactly. William Marks is a great example, but also Austin Cowles and Leonard Sobey. And we also see the same kinds of things outside the LDS movement, where people, both friendly and antagonistic, were implicating Joseph, even if they weren't involved in the LDS, even if they weren't Brighamites or Josephites, like whatever movement they're part of. I mean, if they weren't part of LDS at all, then they're also still implicating Joseph. Then the constellation of these sources all together, corroborating on the same narrative, really strengthens the argument that Joseph was involved in this, right? Hilariously, skeptics will view this as ironic. They'll say the handshaking that happens, I've heard them say, the handshaking that happens between critics of Joseph and Joseph's allies, like members of the church who were believing in Joseph's propheticness, shaking hands over this narrative of polygamy that Joseph started this awful practice. That's so ironic. Well, scholars don't consider it ironic. They consider it strong historical evidence, right? It's just really frustrating.
Yeah, it's really weird that Brigham Young and William Marks would actually agree on this.
Right. That's the thing. Like, if people who hated each other both say the same thing, then that really strengthens the claim.
I mean, the interesting thing, there was a movie called 6 Days in August. I actually got to go to it. It wasn't around for very long, but it was about the succession crisis. And it was funny because I remember I went to an event before the movie came out, and Daniel Peterson got up there and he talked about, he was one of the executive producers, he talked about how they really wanted to portray historical accuracy, and they didn't want to make Sidney Rigdon look like the bad guy. Instead, they made William Marks look like the bad guy.
Oh, poor William.
And I was just, it was funny to me because, I mean, you know, when we look at the split especially, it was really, that I think they did a pretty good job of not making Sidney Rigdon look terrible. Like, that he was really was a good guy, but they really made William Marks, at least from my view, as this conniving. And I had just interviewed Cheryl Bruno and John Dinger about their biography of William Marks, and so my memories of Marks were very fresh, and I was just like, this doesn't seem right. Like, I was impressed what they did for Sidney. I was not impressed what they did for William.
Yeah, fair.
So,
there's also evidence of corroboration across multiple sources in the manner that Joseph was reported to approach people about polygamy. So it seems like, as I look at the evidence, I see that Joseph seemed to approach people consistently, individually, in a private setting, asking them to keep this secret. He used theological justifications about polygamy. He kind of gave an explanation for why we were trying this. He promised eternal rewards if they accepted it. He often inducted men into the practice and asked them at the same time to help him get their sister or some other woman that they knew. So, like, hey, you're allowed, like, you know, if I'm inducting Joe Brown into polygamy, I might say, hey, Joe, you can go pick your own second wife, but while you're at it, would you please help me get your sister Sally? Like, he repeatedly did that, right? At least the sources suggest repeatedly in corroboration that that was an approach he used. He would become stern when he would, and he would threaten their salvation if they didn't accept the principle. And that consistency that we observe across all those sources would have to be orchestrated by somebody if it were a conspiracy rather than the truth. But because we see that this is in antagonistic sources and friendly sources, Brighamite sources, RLDS sources, this same kind of narrative around how Joseph approaches people suggests that Brigham couldn't have contrived that. He couldn't have forced people to falsely recollect how Joseph approached them across the board, right? So that again is evidence of corroboration. And even if you can question the provenance of individual documents, you have to somehow also account for that corroboration if you're going to dismiss the theory, the traditional narrative, right? Okay, another historical approach is this idea of self-damaging disclosures. In legal terms, this is sometimes called statement against interest.
Right.
It's this idea that, like, you're saying something that doesn't put you in a very good light. If you're willing to do that, then often it's more likely to be taken as true. It's something that's more likely to be true if it also reflects poorly on you at the same time. So my favorite example of this is in the Clayton Journal. So we know that the skeptic narrative suggests that in the Clayton Journal there's this it's a fair copy, that it's been doctored, and that all these entries were fabricated later on and inserted into the journal. But if that were true, then you wouldn't expect to find these kinds of statements against self-interest or self-damaging disclosures. So we see these kinds of statements like, there was a rejection of Sarah Ann Whitney and Emily Partridge of William Clayton. So, like, he reported, like, I tried to court these two women and they rejected me. Why would he include that reflects poorly on him.
So Joseph was going after those.
No, not that Joseph was, but that William Clayton himself was. So why would if William Clayton is writing this journal out about polygamy and he's trying to make Joseph or himself look good, why would he include this thing about women who had rejected him? He would want the appearance to be that everybody was enthusiastic to embrace this doctrine, right? If he were fabricating this later, he wouldn't have included rejections, right?
Okay, so let me make sure I'm clear on that. Because was it William Clayton going after the Whitney sisters, or was it Joseph Smith going after the Whitney sisters?
Yeah, no. In this example, it was Clayton who was seeking Sarah Ann Whitney and Emily Partridge at different times, and he was rejected by both of them. There were other women who he was more successful with, but the fact that he tried to court these women, initiate them into polygamy, and they rejected him.
It's so funny because the Partridge sisters were wives of Joseph, allegedly, as well as the Whitney sisters. So when you said both of those, I was thinking it was Joseph, but you're saying it was Clayton.
Yeah, no. So I don't know if he approached them first before Joseph, or if he got to them late, or I don't know how that went. I didn't check the data for that closely enough. But another example is that he expresses his own feelings of emotional turmoil and guilt about the practice of polygamy in the journal.
So he's not pro-polygamy.
No. Why
he's
would
nervous
he
about it.
Yes. Why would he disclose that if he was trying to create a false after-the-fact narrative?
Just covered for legitimacy.
Just so it would look,
show that it's fake
really authentic. He expressed doubts about the practice. He expressed that he was concerned about his wife's emotions and her feelings of alienation when he was engaging in the practice, and she had to, be party to that. He wrote in the journal members' criticisms and skepticism towards the practice as well. He wrote that Joseph threatened to excommunicate Clayton for engendering a child with Margaret Moon. So even though polygamy was apparently sanctioned by Joseph, having children within polygamous relationships was not at that point. And so Joseph got up in Clayton's face about it. It was like, "How dare you? What are you thinking? You have a wife, but you can't have a child with her." But if you were trying to create a narrative that Joseph started polygamy, you wouldn't include this denunciation of childbearing as part of that.
You need to send me the reference for that, because that's very interesting. That will definitely help me with something I might be working on.
There's also Brigham Young. There's an assertion in the journal that Joseph says Brigham Young had transgressed about something relating to polygamy. And again, it seems like if Brigham Young was trying to create this narrative after the fact, he wouldn't have created some kind of self-damaging disclosure to make him look bad, right? He would want himself to look good in this false narrative. And then also Samuel Smith, it's in this journal where Samuel Smith was designated as the successor if Joseph and Hiram died. But if Brigham poisoned Samuel, if Brigham wanted to set himself up as successor, he wouldn't include this fact along with the rest of the narrative, right? So there's all kinds of self-damaging disclosures in this journal that support its provenance and authenticity, even though it might be a fair copy, even though it might legitimately have been, cleaned up at some later time. This evidence suggests that it was retained as its mostly original form, right? Otherwise, you would doctor all this, right? Yeah. You would doctor it. We also find that the testimony of RLDS leaders who recalled Joseph Jr.'s polygamy, even though Joseph III was trying to deny it. Remember that? That's. We already talked about that, but that's another example of self-damaging disclosure, right? If your church is trying to distance itself from polygamy, and you say, actually Joseph practiced polygamy, that's damaging for your own church, but you're standing by the truth, and so that seems to suggest that Joseph really did. Okay, and the last piece of historical the historical approach that seems to be ignored by skeptics is context and coherence. So there's this idea of if you look at all the evidence together, if we try to look at the contextual credibility of everything as a unit and what was going on outside of that might have been informing the events that we're describing, how does it all fit together and interrelate? Can you create a whole narrative that makes sense? And the Brigham Young conspiracy theory just doesn't match. For example, it would require that Brigham Young was that he was this lecherous, awful person that Joseph revered enough to give power to and appoint to the Quorum of the 12, and that all the other members of the Quorum of the 12 who were also involved in polygamy were willing to follow Brigham with preeminent respect rather than Joseph, that they were more on Brigham's side than they were on Joseph's side, even though Joseph was the one who was president of the church and who appointed them members of the 12. Like, so the mismatched loyalty doesn't match the narrative that we know, where people would die for Joseph and they loved Joseph and they would risk their lives for Joseph and they would sacrifice their lives for the kingdom and they would keep moving from house to house and be driven out from place to place, and that doesn't match this mentality of like, yeah, however many times Joseph denies, we're just gonna keep doing this lecherous thing. It also is entirely implausible that Joseph would have never denounced the practice in private as well as public. So remember earlier I said, like, these public denunciations, people were inoculated, according to the Brigham Young theory, people were inoculated against these denunciations, right? The only way that would work is if Joseph never in private ever said to the members of the 12, hey, nobody's around, but listen, I'm serious about this. You can't practice polygamy. I've heard rumors that all of you are involved in this and you got to knock it off. I'm for real. Nobody's around. This is not a public denunciation, right? If Joseph had ever done that, you have to assume he would have done that if this is really what was going on, right? If the Brigham Young theory was really right. If that really happened, there's no contextual coherence or credibility to the idea that all the 12 would be like, up yours, Joseph. Like, we side with Brigham. Like, they were willing to sacrifice their lives for him. They loved him. It was such a cult of personality. Like, Joseph was their leader. He was their guy. There was no way that they would side with Brigham over Joseph if Joseph really legitimately denounced polygamy to them in private, right? Okay, so there's lots of other contextual things that seem to suggest that Joseph could have legitimately practiced polygamy that skeptics consistently ignore. So one is that Joseph's syncretism makes it not implausible that he would have adopted this Cochranite practice of plural wifery, right? So you have to remember, Joseph was like the preeminent collector of ideas and things. He was gathering up all the kinds of religious ideas in the zeitgeist and putting it into Mormonism. So examples are like the idea of Adventism, Restorationism, Proto-Zionism, that, you know, everybody in the zeitgeist of this early American period wanted Jews to gather to America. Charismatic spiritualism, prophetic leadership, dispensationalism. There's all kinds of other similarities with Protestantism, especially with Methodism, that he's gathering into the church. Personal revelation as an individual responsibility, Melchizedek priesthood. This idea of Melchizedek priesthood, this is a borrowed idea from other scholars at the time. It seemed to be in the air. Three kingdoms of glory. He wasn't the first person to propose that. Word of wisdom. All kinds of these what we perceive today as unique LDS teachings were in the air at the time, and he was collecting these and putting them into a system of religion that we now know as Mormonism. But they died out in every other area of life except in our church, and so today they appear unique, but they weren't unique in Joseph's day. So if Joseph was exposed to this idea of plural wives and other alternative marriage systems, it's consistent with his MO that he might have adopted that and tried to make it a part of everything else he was doing.
Are you saying the Cochranites might have influenced Joseph to do polygamy?
I'm suggesting maybe. That's not outside the realm of possibility. Though I will say
that would be very terrible for the skeptics, though, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
If we could tie the Cochranites to Joseph?
To Joseph instead of Brigham. But I will say in favor of the polygamy skeptics that one could argue something similar about Brigham. Brigham actually implemented at least four major doctrinal innovations in the church after Joseph died, and these are that polygamy was necessary for salvation. Even if Joseph started polygamy, Brigham institutionalized it as necessary for exaltation. That wasn't a Joseph thing. The race and priesthood ban, that started with Brigham Young. The idea of blood atonement started with Brigham Young, and the Adam God theory started with Brigham Young. So if Brigham Young is inventing,
Polygamists will argue with you on that.
If Brigham is starting these other elements of doctrinal innovations, then it is possible from just considering the contextual environment, it is possible to say, well, Brigham might have also instantiated polygamy as well, given his penchant for starting other doctrinal innovations, right? So that aspect of contextual credibility could go either direction. Like either Brigham or Joseph could have likely started this based on what else was going on around them, right? However, skeptics also claim that Joseph wouldn't contradict his previous revelations that had commanded monogamy, whether they were in Scripture or other revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants. But that theology, but Joseph's theology evolved in all kinds of ways over time. He changed on issues relating to the Godhead. He became less Trinitarian over time, right? He ended up solving the problem of Alvin not getting to the celestial kingdom or not getting to heaven multiple ways at multiple times, right? Like he taught that, if you would have accepted it, had you had the opportunity, then you'd be saved. He instituted proxy baptism and said, oh, this is a way you can have the ordinance, right? These are different solutions at different times as his theology is evolving. Of course, there's the 1835 retrospective insertions of priesthood into the Revelations. Priesthood was, not really an idea, like Melchizedek priesthood and certain offices. Like these are 1835 innovations that he then goes back and retrospectively inserts into the records to make it look like for the first 5 years of history, we had, we had the same form of priesthood that we're talking about now, 2 orders and different offices.
Am I talking to John Hamer?
He also made temple changes, like the way that the Kirtland temple ordinances were performed versus the way that Nauvoo temple ordinances were performed. Radically different, night and day, types of ordinances, right? So if you look at all the ways in which Joseph's theology shifted over time, then you could say, well, Joseph might have shifted on monogamy as well. Like he could have become polygamist over time. That's not out of the realm of possibility given Joseph's penchant for shifting. And of course, Joseph seemed to adopt a kind of relativistic moral code in the 1840s. So this is best exhibited in the Nancy Rigdon letter, the happiness letter.
Oh yes.
But because that's viewed with suspicion, then I'll just set that aside for a minute and I'll just focus on a different quote. So elsewhere he said, if you do not accuse each other, God will not accuse you. If you have no accuser, you will enter heaven. And if you will follow the revelations and instructions which God gives you through me, I will take you into heaven as my backload. If you will not accuse me, I will not accuse you. If you will throw a cloak of charity over my sins, I will over yours. For charity covereth a multitude of sins. What many people call sin is not a sin. I do many things to break down superstition, and I will break it down.
Oh, wow. Where does that come from?
That comes... I'll have to figure it out. I didn't write the source.
I've heard that parts of that, but yeah, that was great.
But when you look at that kind of moral relativism, that idea that like something isn't wrong unless somebody accuses you, then that is consistent with this idea that like polygamy might be wrong if it's harmful to people, if people don't like it, or if people accuse you of it. But if you're sanctioned by God and people are not hurt by it, then maybe it isn't a sin. If people aren't accusing you, if people aren't pointing fingers and saying you lecherous or you adulterous or you abusive man, then according to Joseph moral relativism, it might be okay. And he better articulates that in the Nancy Rigdon letter. But if that's suspect, then we can find it other places as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does that corroborate the Nancy Rigdon letter?
I think it does. I think so. The other thing about the Nancy Rigdon letter that's hilarious to me is
the happiness letter.
The happiness letter, exactly. If you if you look at the polygamy skeptics arguments against it, then they will say it was published in John C. Bennett's book, and that automatically makes it a suspect because John C. Bennett was, he was a notorious liar and exaggerator, right? He got a lot of things right, but he also exaggerated a ton. And you're not sure whether, it's like with the Hoffman forgeries, right? If anything passed through Hoffman's hand, it might not have been a forgery, but you just can't trust it anymore.
Right.
So if it's in John C. Bennett's book, we just don't know.
Because he would trade for legitimate documents and then increase the value.
Yep. Yeah. So the other thing about this letter is that Sidney Rigdon ends up giving if I could say, a carefully worded denial of that being from Joseph. But the way he does that is so fascinating. In fact, I'll read it because I think it's so telling the way he denies that the happiness letter was written by Joseph. He says in the newspaper, "Dear sir, I am fully authorized by my daughter Nancy to say to the public through the medium of your paper that the letter which has appeared in the Sangamo Journal, making part of General Bennett's letters to said paper, purporting to have been written by Mr. Joseph Smith to her, was unauthorized by her, and that she never said to General Bennett or any other person that said letter was written by Mr. Smith, nor in his handwriting, but by another person, and in another person's handwriting. She further wishes me to say that she never at any time authorized General Bennett to use her name in the public papers, as he has done, which has been greatly to the wounding of her feelings, and she considers that the obtruding of her name before the public in the manner in which he has been done, to say the best of it, is a flagrant violation of the rules of gallantry, and cannot avoid to insult her feelings, which she wishes the public to know. I would further state that Mr. Smith denied to me the authorship of that letter." So he says, we think Joseph didn't write this letter, but mostly he focuses on the fact that it wasn't in Joseph's handwriting, right? Somebody else wrote the letter. And we know that that's how Joseph operated all the time. He dictated things to people, and it was probably in somebody else's hand.
Nothing was in his handwriting.
And mostly his frustration here is that he published this letter without Nancy's permission, right? It wasn't that,
anything was wrong.
It's not,
inaccurate.
He again carefully wordedly denies that Joseph Smith wrote this letter, but in a way that still leaves open the possibility that he did write the letter, but that it wasn't in his own hand, right? It was maybe he dictated it, but I'm not going to say he didn't dictate it, right? Instead, I'm just going to say he didn't write it. It's not by his hand. And so what you end up with is, my daughter's feelings were hurt because you published this letter that she didn't think you were going to publish. And certainly nobody ever said that was in Joseph's handwriting. So when polygamy skeptics look at that denunciation by Sidney, and they look at the fact that it was in John C. Bennett's book, and they say, we can't count this as evidence anymore, you still have to come back with, well, what is the plausible alternative by which this letter came about? Who wrote it then? Because this letter is theologically rich with justifications that make sense within Joseph's worldview. It's corroborated and consistent with Joseph's other teachings. So it suggests that if somebody were writing it, they'd have to be in Joseph's head. They'd have to understand his manner of thinking about polygamy. Right? They would have to be able to recreate something that seemed consistent with the other things that we're seeing that are also purported to be through Joseph, of Joseph, about polygamy, right? So that's a huge problem with with people's desire to dismiss that letter. Okay, but another point that I want to make is that the introduction of eternal marriage seemed to be hinting at the sealing of the whole human race in a big interconnected net, where you'd be sealed to your spouse, and you'd be sealed to your spouse, and these people would be sealed to their parents. These people would eventually be sealed to Joseph as the patriarch of this whole church, right? And he would bring them into heaven as backload, right? He was just going to hold the whole church. God, if you respect me, you better respect them too, because they're my lot, they're my loves, and I'm just bringing them all in, right? So that seems to be the theology that he was operating in. But that doctrine introduced the problem of eternal spinsters and eternal bastard children. If people were not getting married, then you're not coming into heaven. You're just alone. You're a loner, and heaven isn't made for that. Heaven is to be interconnected. So the solution for that, before I say the solution, the other problem is Hiram's like Hiram perfectly illustrates when he wants to be sealed to his second wife, because otherwise she wouldn't be sealed to anybody, but his first wife had already died. What do you do? Like if you've already been sealed to one wife and that's the only one you can be sealed to, then your second wife might be married to you for time, but she's going to be alone in heaven, right? And so you need solutions for these kinds of spinster problems, these late marriage problems, these bastard children problems. Like if they can't be sealed to parents, who did they get married to? Who do they get sealed to, right? In this big net of heaven. And the solution for that becomes obvious in Joseph's framework. When you start to read, like, some of the quotes and some of the ways that he was thinking, you start to realize that polygamy was the solution to those single people who were left out of the net of heaven. And even if it starts, as it was in Hiram's case, as a solution on the other side of the veil only, once you allow for polygamy as a heavenly solution, it's not hard to transplant it back to earth. And my life is an example of this, actually, because like my wife is 26 years older than me, and that's a very socially unacceptable kind of relationship. We started dating when I was 18 years old, and she was 43.
Wow.
I served my mission. I came home. She was 45. We got married, and this is a very socially problematic, socially scorned kind of thing. Like, people especially gave her flack because as they looked at our relationship, they would say like, how dare you like steal that boy's future? And what are you doing? My mom threatened at one point. She said, if my son wasn't 18, I'd have your butt slapped in jail. Because it's just scandalous, right? Well, it was scandalous for me too when we first started seeing each other, and we met in a mutual work environment, and we were just close friends for a long time first, and then eventually we fell in love. But we didn't know what to do with that because it was so socially unacceptable that it wasn't even a thought. Like marriage wasn't on the table. It wasn't even like we considered it and rejected it. We just couldn't even think about it. It was just completely off the table. But one time I had a conversation with her and I said, well, hon, if you end up dying and never marry anybody, maybe when I die, we could be sealed on the other side. And once I allowed in my mind for the fact that like these two spiritual eternal entities could be married in some other state, then I started wondering, well, if we could be married there, why couldn't we be married here? What rule says like somebody couldn't be married just because they're a big age difference, right? So in my little 18-year-old mind, I did the same thing that Joseph potentially did. I transplanted back the solution from heaven to earth, to this temporal existence. And I said, well, maybe we could get married now. And as soon as it was like a gateway drug. It was like a bridge, right? It was like heaven was a bridge to doing this thing, right? And so I really think that the same thing happened in Joseph's own thinking when he was trying to solve this eternal heavenly net problem. And there was spinsters and bastard children and second wives who, subsequent wives, not simultaneous wives, that were unsealed. He first invented the solution of heavenly sealings, where polygamy would be a heavenly thing only, and then later realized that, well, if it's okay in heaven, it's maybe okay on earth. So you can kind of translate that backwards.
Is that how we got Hiram to accept it, do you think?
I think there's, I've read evidence that suggests very much that was like a gateway thing for Hiram as well. Yeah. And
well, going back to that 6 days in August, I was really surprised. Because with Brigham Young, so he supposedly he says when he first heard about polygamy, he desired the grave.
Yeah,
I was shocked that wasn't in the movie. Number one, because I expected it to be. But number two, in the movie, it showed that when Joseph told Hiram that he could be married to his first wife, he also told Brigham that he could be married to his first wife because she had died in childbirth.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't remember that as part of Brigham Young's.
I haven't read that source. I don't know if that was
a
creative
director's license
or,
there or,
I don't
or
know.
But it makes sense if you're going to convince somebody, oh, well, you could be married to your first wife who you love. I mean, it would make sense to me.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, another contextual credibility issue that we have to consider if we're going to be, academic historians. We have to look at the whole picture. We have to consider, did other church leaders who were engaged in polygamy deny engaging in polygamy? Or was that a uniquely Joseph thing?
Oh, there you go.
If Joseph is the only person who is denying polygamy, then we could say maybe he was really sincere about it.
Brigham had denied it before he announced it.
It was before, yeah. Here's the difficulty.
Like John Kerry now.
There's very few evidences, actually, of people publicly denying polygamy among other church leaders, right? Even though we know that
there's little evidence, you say?
Very little evidence, yeah, hardly any at all. There are a couple of potential examples of Parley P. Pratt and John Taylor having published or publishing something that seemed to deny it either on behalf of the church or on behalf of themselves or something like that. But in both cases, it appears to be before they themselves started practicing polygamy. So like Parley P. Pratt's denial was in 1842 and his purported first wife was in 1843. And even though John Taylor was in 1844 and his wife was also in 1844, it was later that year when he, after he published that statement, when he took his first plural wife. So that actually could be evidence in favor of the polygamy skeptics narrative that suggests if a bunch of other people were all denying polygamy, then we would say, well, okay, Joseph was also, but everybody was, and so it doesn't matter. But because Joseph's denials appear to be unique, they might hold more credence. So that's just a consideration. We also have to consider whether there are extant contemporaneous records of polygamous marriages for leaders other than Joseph, because there's very little evidence for Joseph's contemporaneous marriages. There's that one piece of evidence in the cipher in Brigham's journal, right, that Joseph went and sealed Agnes, right? That's one example, but there's hardly any examples like that that record Joseph's marriages during his lifetime. Almost everything else comes after his death, right? But if that's unique, and other people who are engaging in plural marriage have a bunch of evidence, like they have marriage certificates, or they wrote it in their Bible, or they wrote it in their journal.
You can't get a marriage certificate when it's illegal, right?
No, I guess that's true, yeah. But if there's other forms of evidence, like if they write it in their journal, like I was sealed to my plural wife today, or something like that, then that suggests, again, further evidence for the polygamy skeptic narrative, because it looks like Joseph is a singular kind of thing then. Like Joseph is the only one who is engaging in plural marriage, but with no evidence. So we have to look whether there was actually evidence for other plural marriages. And it looks like William Clayton recorded his sealing in his journal to Margaret Moon. It looks like there were Nauvoo temple records that were extant before Joseph's death, and Heber C. Kimball records his sealing to Sarah Noon in his journal. So there were other examples of contemporaneous recordings of entering into polygamous marriages. So that may again be like a tick in the favor of the polygamy skeptics narrative. So you just have to consider this issue as a whole. But unfortunately, there are also plural marriages that were not recorded, which then weakens the skeptics' argument, right? So, like for example, Lucy Decker married Brigham in 1842, but that sealing wasn't recorded until the 1846 Nauvoo temple records. And then we didn't have a public date nobody said when they were sealed. Like even in the 1846 Nauvoo temple records, they didn't say when they were originally sealed. They just recorded the temple sealing. It was a resealing, yes. We didn't find out that Lucy Decker was married to Brigham Young in 1842 until an affidavit was signed in 1869. So that's quite a long time later. And that suggests if this really did happen in 1842, but we don't find out about it for another 30 years, then there were some anonymous, unevidenced marriages going on, and maybe Joseph's was just along with the rest,
Okay.
So it's, that the evidence that direction doesn't strongly favor either theory, really, when you start to look at both sides. Another contextual consideration is that polygamy was, of course, a secret, and that has to inform our interpretation of the evidence. Everyone was lying about polygamy at the time. Women later testified that they were told they had to deny it if they were ever asked directly about it. They were told, or the Relief Society signed a statement, like all the members of the Relief Society board, or the Relief Society, I can't remember if it was like all the members of the Relief Society or what, but like the Relief Society signed a statement where each individual person signed their name to this statement that they didn't know about any form of plural marriage, that they hadn't heard of it.
Emma make him sign that?
Emma was one of the people who signed it, but so did Eliza R. Snow and some other people who were purportedly later married to Joseph Smith. And so, like, some of these people were saying, we don't know about any polygamy, even though they were at the time engaging in polygamy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And polygamy skeptics will say, well, somebody like Eliza R. Snow, who says at one time I wasn't in polygamy and at another time I was married to Joseph in polygamy, you can't trust that person at all because they were lying at one time or the other and we don't know which one, and so you just have to throw out the evidence. Well, that's not entirely fair if everybody at the time was also lying. Like if it was just in the zeitgeist and everybody was expected to lie and they were told to lie about it.
Well, once again, this comes to motivated reasoning. It sure makes it easier when you can throw out all that evidence.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So that's a contextual historical. I mean, that's a historical approach that you have to take when you're considering the evidence. You have to look at the contextual credibility of this. There's also evidence that the historical records and revelations were in fact altered. Like we said, there's this statement in the October 5th journal that says like to be revised, and they add in unless Joseph or unless God commands otherwise, right? And they're altering some of the records, but scribes did that kind of thing under Joseph's direction all the time. In the Book of Mormon translations, in Doctrine and Covenants,
if
Revelations.
you go to the Temple Lot Church in Independence, one of the things they will say, because it's happened to me, pull out your section 20. Yeah. I'm going to pull out my essentially section 20 in the Book of Commandments.
Yeah.
What's different? And then they will go through the difference. And I was like, I already knew about that. Don't worry.
Yeah.
And I remember he was surprised that I was pretty casual about it.
Yeah.
So,
but Joseph did this kind of thing all the time. And we know that Brigham Young did, in fact, alter documents after going to Utah. But the question is, which ones were after Utah and which ones were with Joseph's authorization? We don't know.
Right.
And so we don't know, for example, if DNC 132 was altered or were added to at some point.
And we do know that Joseph revised various sections in the Doctrine and Covenants.
Yep.
I mean, you can trace it from 1835 to 1842. I don't remember all the years, 1869, which obviously would be too late. But he did revise sections in the Revelation.
Yes. And so if that's happening, then you have to give space for the fact that some of the revisions that we're ascribing to Brigham Young as nefarious might have been under Joseph's direction.
Right.
And we just don't know because we don't know who made the revisions and we don't know when they made the revisions. So it's impossible to say that, whether this is actually in favor of the conspiracy theory or whether it's just Joseph's MO of just, modifying documents to create a more coherent and homogeneous narrative.
Yeah.
And then I will lastly say that I don't personally think Joseph had narcissistic personality disorder, but I think
I love it.
But I do think he shared a lot of symptoms with narcissism.
Oh, really?
I do think
because I hear that a lot, especially among. I'm trying to decide if I should say anti-Mormons or critics of Mormonism.
Yeah.
But there's a lot.
I'll give some examples. So, one of the symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder is an unreasonable expectation for others to comply with your demands. Joseph repeatedly asked people to give up their homes and money for his goals for the church. And he was relatively patient when people didn't. So that, that's not entirely narcissistic, but he certainly had an unreasonable expectation of people to sacrifice substantial amounts of money and time and homes. Yes. And he sometimes used threatening and manipulative approaches to get them to comply. He also engaged in exploitative behavior, like living on the charity of other people's, having other people build his mansion homes in Nauvoo by revelation, like, I, the Lord, command that this house shall be built for my servant Joseph, that kind of thing. There seems to be belief. One of the symptoms is a belief in your own superiority and a grandiose sense of self-importance. One quote that illustrates this is Joseph said, "I have more to boast of than any man ever had. I am the only man that has ever been able to keep a whole church together since the days of Adam. I know more than all the world put together." So that's illustrative of that kind of grandiose mentality. Another example is a preoccupation with fantasies of success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love. And this is reflected, I think, in really positive ways, but still that reflect a degree of narcissism in his having many visions and revelations, starting a bank, building cities, campaigning for U.S. president, attempting to establish a theocracy where he was ordained to be a king by the Council of 50. So all these kinds of things lead into that like grandiose vision of like, just desiring power and desiring to build. And I have a lot of respect for Joseph's character. I think he was very sincere. And when he wanted to accumulate power, I don't think it was very often because he wanted to like manipulate other people or because he was sadistic. I think it was usually because he wanted the power to be able to do good in the world. I perceive that in Joseph. Yet, this is still a characteristic of narcissistic personality disorder, right?
Okay.
He also exhibits arrogant behavior. For example, he chose to go by the title General Smith, even in non-military, social, or religious contexts, which seems, maybe a little haughty. Another symptom is being really envious of other people. So he comments that. There are comments he makes that reflect irritation and resentment toward the influence and popularity that Oliver Cowdery seemed to be growing and that Sidney Rigdon seemed to be growing among members. And at times he would kind of put them in their place, kind of cut them under because they seemed to be like getting too much influence in the church and he wanted to reestablish his own preeminence. And then finally, he seemed to have an undying need for admiration and a difficulty handling criticism. Like he once punched Thomas Sharp for publishing anti-Mormon things.
He deserved it.
He sharply rebuked and castigated people who criticized him. In fact, he instantiated that principle in the Doctrine and Covenants, or the Lord did. I don't know which, or maybe both. When he said, like, you shall rebuke them at times with sharpness, and then show afterwards an increase of love, right? So Joseph was showing by that his own MO. He was saying, like, this is how I operate. I will criticize you sharply, and then later on we'll apologize, we'll hug, we'll make up, everything's gonna be fine. But like, there's gonna be some moments when I'm pretty PO'd, right? Mm-hmm. He also retaliated against the expositor. There's this whole chapter on the honor culture in Bushman's Rough Stone Rolling that exhibits all these kinds of behaviors that reflect at least a kind of Southern honor culture at minimum, but potentially bordering, as I interpret it, on narcissistic personality disorder. And somebody who has borderline narcissistic personality disorder is much more likely to engage in a practice like polygamy that is potentially damaging to other people for purposes of self-gain, even if, as I ascribe to Joseph, really, pretty charitable intentions and good intentions. It's more an obliviousness towards the potential ramifications that practice could have for other people. So it's not like he intended it to be harmful to them. It's just like maybe he was oblivious to the fact that it would be harmful to some other people. And then I'll just say this final thing, because I already hinted about the fact that Joseph had potentially dissociative episodes because of early traumas. I'll just say that this is part of the contextual history in which we have to understand Joseph Smith. Like, he, during his childhood, had at least 3, maybe 4 major surgeries without anesthesia. Right? And those repeated surgeries, Dr. Bill Moraine wrote the book "The Sword of Laban." He's a doctor, a medical doctor in the Community of Christ, and he wrote this book to explore the symptoms that he observes in Joseph's later life, and ties it to the medical incidents in his childhood, because as a doctor, he had observed. Dr. Moraine had observed that young children who were burn victims in the burn unit ended up having serious psychological trauma that it was inflicted on them by the repeated need to change out bandages that seemed to be condoned by their parents and doctors who were supposed to be on their side. And it feels like a gross betrayal, because even though you might intellectually at a young age, you might understand that this is for your good, you can't emotionally reconcile that with the fact that these people who are supposed to be your caretakers and on your side and protecting you are inflicting repeated horrific pain on your body. And so like every time you switch out these bandages, that's just like another betrayal. So as he observes the kind of dissociation that those burn victims experience in adulthood, he sees the same kind of thing happening in Joseph as a result of his multiple surgeries without any kind of anesthesia. And then he points out that this is, I was shocked when I read this, and I could not believe that this is not more prevalent in anti-Mormon material. But Joseph Sr. exhumed Alvin's body on the 1-year anniversary of Alvin's death.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so Joseph is in his early teens, right? It's already traumatic enough that Alvin died because Joseph Sr. was a bit of a lush, pretty unstable. He was known to be a drunkard and really unstable. He was like a maudlin drunk. He wasn't abusive of his family at all, but he wasn't a very good provider because of his alcohol problems. And of course, later histories apologetically tried to kind of like bury that a little, but that like it comes out in narratives anyway. So you see this early influence, and people reporting that Alvin was the one who was kind of caring for the family, ensuring that they had enough food to eat, working hard to make sure that they made a living. The only reason why they were able to carry a farm and be able to be upstanding members of society was because of Alvin. So when he dies, it's an enormously traumatic event for the whole family. But then 1 year later, they go through this exhumation. And the only reason we know about this is because Joseph Sr. publishes, after the fact, in the newspaper, this statement that's kind of like, it says like, how dare all of you make threats that you were going to be molesting Alvin's body? It's hard enough that we lost our beloved son anyway, and for you all to be threatening to accost his dead body all this time later. That we had to dig up his body to check and make sure that nobody had accosted him, right? And you're like, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense, because if you worry that somebody might be like bothering your son's body. First of all, who does that? Second of all, if you're worried about this, all you have to do is go to his grave and see the ground is undisturbed. But instead, they dug him up and checked. Bill Moraine suggests that because of the magic culture in which Joseph was raised, the whole family was probably just They probably were attempting some kind of necromancy ritual to see if they could bring Alvin back from the dead.
Oh, wow.
That's the alternative theory that's proposed. Based on this, we have no evidence of this, right? The only evidence we have is this little newspaper clipping that's like accusing the town. But the newspaper clipping makes no sense. And there's no other reason why he would exhume Alvin on the anniversary of his death, right? Unless there was some mystical reason, like some meaningful reason that was beyond just the potential perturbing of his body, right? So anyway, you can imagine whatever the reason, even whether it was, the stated reason in the newspaper or for some kind of necromancy magic or whatever it was, you can imagine the horror, the trauma that's inflicted on Joseph yet again 1 year later, when already he's lost his beloved brother, who's a stable influence in his family, and now he has to observe the decayed and dead body of his brother that he probably helped dig up. He was probably asked by his dad to help dig the hole, right? To unbury his son, and then maybe potentially try to engage in some kind of magic and fail at that and have the loss of that, the hope and the crashed hope all over again of the second loss of your beloved brother. Anyway, Bill Moraine ties these and other traumatic events together and says, because another example is after Joseph's final surgery, he had to be sent to the sea, and this felt like another betrayal because, the idea was just people are sent to the seaside to to kind of recover, the fresh sea air or whatever. Even today, we will still say like, you might need to go to a warmer climate or a better place to get better because, some environments are just perceived as not that good for healing. So in Joseph's immediate environment, it was perceived that, that wouldn't be a very good environment for healing. So they sent him off to live with relatives at the sea for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And that would again feel like another betrayal. So with these repeated traumas and betrayals that Joseph is feeling, this would inculcate in him a dissociative disorder, much like Bill Moraine saw in his burn victim children, right? So I'm laid all that out. That's a really much too long an explanation, but I've laid all of that out to say that we have to understand Joseph not through a privileged prophetic lens, but through the very human person that he was. He may have had a calling as a prophet, but he may have also had dissociative identity disorder. He may have also really struggled with certain traumas and PTSD and honor culture and narcissistic personality disorder. And if he experienced all of that and was also a true prophet, you can imagine the mix of characteristics there. God illustrates all through the Old Testament that he's willing to call fallen people, very broken people, to do very hard things. And sometimes they fail and sometimes they succeed. But in the midst of all of that, they're also committing atrocities, and probably not in the name of the Lord, even though it might be claimed that. But you can see, like, to me, the primary message of the Old Testament is God calls fallen people. So if we look at Joseph and we take him as the fully three-dimensional character that he was, warts and all, we can understand that somebody like that might really have started polygamy. Like, you can see that his characteristics would potentially lend themselves to engaging in a practice like that. Yeah.
I did not know Bill Moraine was a MD. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Jesse James, a research psychologist. Our next conversation with him will be our last, but it's only going to be available to newsletter subscribers. Go to gospeltangents.com/newsletter, and I'll send you a free link to the final part of our conversation. Also, we're going to be talking about the questions you should be asking your conspiracy theorist friends.
Another question is whether it's logically consistent. You have to ask, what's being presented, is this logically consistent? Does it utilize circular reasoning? Does it contradict itself? Often the same conspiracy theorists will, like I said, believe in contradictory pieces of evidence or contradictory theories, right? So an example is like in Princess Diana's death, people often believed that Princess Diana faked her own death and is still alive. Or
Elvis too?
That Princess Diana was murdered.
She's hanging out with Elvis? Who works for the FBI? Thanks for listening, and I hope you continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.